So let's get started. So this is kind of the overview of what we're going to be talking about in this sort of 30 minutes or so. So ARUP and the British Geological Survey, we were commissioned to undertake this research to understand the current geothermal energy sector in Northern Ireland. So we're commissioned by the Department for Economy. This presentation will sort of summarise our report findings and recommendations for the future. I will speak about the first half of the report, the background, the overview of the systems, conceptual model and technologies, and then Corinna is going to pick up the policy research and benchmarking process. We'll finish the talk with our suggestions for changes to policy and regulation, which may unlock Northern Ireland's geothermal resource in the future. And then, of course, we'll touch on any progress that's been made since this report was completed last December. So first of all, this was the project remit. I feel like I always need a slide on this. We targeted all the points on this list, but there are, of course, so many different links that we could have explored. But it's worth remembering that overall, this research project was to focus on the policy, legislation, regulation, and how it can facilitate resource development and mitigate risk. The findings are being used to support the delivery of the Northern Ireland Energy Strategy, which is key decarbonising heat objectives, to formulate evidence-based policy options, to identify suitable mechanisms to support the expansion of the geothermal sector here in Northern Ireland, to inform future geothermal demonstration projects, and finally to provide our ministers with the information needed to make fully informed decisions about future geothermal policy. The front end of the report kind of set the scene. It's got the UK, Northern Ireland strategies, including the goal for achieving net zero carbon energy by 2050. And we describe the applications for geothermal energy from small spas, agricultural production, heating for homes to large scale power plants. And now with the technological development, how deep geothermal has the potential to be utilised in almost any setting. We touched on the fact that the air temperatures are expected to become warmer in response to climate change. So the use of geothermal energy for cooling could also be significant. Just strange thinking it's freezing here in the north. And of course, we referenced the great work that the GSNI and others have done assessing the geothermal resources here. Then we touch on the risks and opportunities of geothermal, such as the high upfront capital costs, perceived and actual risks, whether they are financial or geological. And then, of course, there's a lack of incentives for geothermal technologies and a previous Northern Ireland governmental scandal. But despite all of this, all the negativity, geothermal can definitely be turned into new skills, supply chain investment, and we could build a confident sector. As you know, I know many different webinars in the past have kind of covered the geology of Northern Ireland and different geothermal technologies. So we're going to keep this quite light touch and kind of focus more of the talk on the regulation. But Northern Ireland's geology is suitable for development of shallow and deep geothermal energy systems. Both provide a key contribution to the energy mix of the future, particularly in combination with other types of renewable energy resources and obviously technological developments. Open and closed loop systems are both possible in Northern Ireland. For the shallower systems, the size of project is governed by the building's energy requirement and the energy available from the ground. Our report touched on ambient loops and the increasing interest in utilising the mine workings, mine water treatment schemes for the source of heat, cooling or thermal storage. And one thing to note the report, we refer to the deep geothermal as heat resources from depths greater than 500 meters below the ground surface. We do understand in some authorities it's greater than 400, but for this we used 500. Based on the geology, there obviously is significant potential for deep geothermal projects, particularly heat projects in the island. And then this risk profile was included as it's a good way to show the risk of failure throughout the project life and the costs along the journey. This obviously is very specific to deep geothermal projects as the risks are much higher. And right now we're at the very start. Our risks are so high. There's such limited information on the deep geology, and we have a low confidence at the moment on permeability and fault characteristics. There's the risk in drilling complexities, requirements for higher cost specialist drilling equipment. And at the moment, we think there's a lack of projects due to this risk profiles. The risks are high until the first few boreholes are drilled. And of course, the first borehole is expensive to do. So around 30 to 40% of capital costs are needed to get to this point. But if we create a scenario where the price of heat is advantageous to developers and secured within the government, then the financial model is much easier to demonstrate. So it was outside of our remit to sort of do a reassessment of all geothermal resources. We used a lot of information supplied by the client and published data to develop a conceptual model. So obviously this geological, hydrogeological, mineral data from the GSNI, and we referred mostly to these 3 key reports throughout. And to skim through this geology from our complicated island, we focused on the rock types and conditions that are most suited to geothermal projects. So obviously the superficials for shallow systems. And for this, the purpose of this model, we didn't assess them in detail, but obviously slinkies, closed loop boreholes. Then we looked at the key sedimentary aquifers within Northern Ireland, which have the potential for open loop systems, such as Triassic, Permian, and Carboniferous. And then published data indicates already that the Sherwood Sandstone Group is definitely a likely resource for deep geothermal energy. So that's in the Rathlin, Larne, and Lough Neagh basins. The Permian and Carboniferous sandstones are marginally less promising, but still strong secondary targets. Then we reviewed the igneous rocks, such as your basalts like Antrim lava grip and the granites in the Mourne Mountains and the Slieve Gullion complex. And the published data indicates that the Antrim basalts, again, are a likely resource for geothermal. However, there are limited knowledge about the reservoir properties of the granite intrusions in the Mourne Mountains and Slieve Gullion. So we've recommended further investigation in this area to understand the temperatures and whether they're suitable for maybe enhanced geothermal systems. We reviewed mine workings, oil and gas data, everything that was provided by the GSNI. And again, we've recommended further investigation work to deduce whether mine water heat in Northern Ireland can offer an economic supply compared to alternative options such as aquifer heat. The oil and gas data, only 15 wells had actually recorded temperature information across the north, and the wells were targeting the Permian and the Sherwood sandstone lithologies in the Rathlin and Lough Neagh basins, and they only went to 2,000 meters. Temperatures, sort of data that exists at the moment, different published reports are estimating at 2,500 meters depth across Northern Ireland. Temperatures will be between Castle and Dungannon. So considering that and temperatures that were recorded in the oil and gas wells, there could be a future opportunity to modify and convert these to provide geothermal heat using new technology being introduced to the market. Obviously, the economic case for repurposing the wells for geothermal has not yet been proven. And this is our conceptual model. So all the geological data was combined into a schematic conceptual model illustrating the key geological features found in Northern Ireland and the main geothermal technologies suitable for each geology. We included both shallow and deep systems and the lithologies where they could be located. Generally, as you can see along the upper part of the model, closed loop geothermal systems are suitable at any location, obviously subject to land availability, regardless of the geology. And then the open loop systems require the aquifers from which groundwater can be abstracted for the heating, cooling, then returned via boreholes or wells. The bottom half of the model is obviously unknown or unconfirmed and where the risks are higher, but the heat is likely to be a much greater temperature. Our next step was then to review various technologies that could be employed to access this energy. Within our remit, we assessed the costs, benefits, risks, and opportunities to help developer decision makers and to help them understand which is the most appropriate technology to deploy. The review was limited to the technologies in this table. We briefly touched on super hot rock systems and underground thermal energy storage, but these two were actually outside of our remit. Within our report, you'll see a number of different tables similar to that shown on the screen. The opportunities were conveyed in terms of energy capacity, capital requirements, and project risks. The review detailed the coefficient of performance for ground source heat pump systems based on heating and output temperatures of up to 65 degrees, which was obviously typical for buildings. Carbon savings were based on emissions compared to gas boilers providing the same energy, and these are based on greenhouse gas carbon emission factors for grid methane and electricity. The carbon required to construct geothermal systems was not factored in this technology assessment. For the deeper geothermal systems where heat pumps are not required, a cost per unit energy was provided as an alternative to the coefficient of performance. And temperature ranges provided were based on average published geothermal gradients in Northern Ireland, which is expected to be 28 to 34 degrees per kilometre depth. Finally, there's this lovely table at the end, which is just a big summary matrix of all available information and for planning purposes only. The table shows the suitable geology, the risk profiles, land disturbance, carbon savings, testing requirements. For the CapEx, we had Geothermal Engineering Limited as a subcontractor who provided indicative costs on the deep technologies. We also used published data sources. Obviously, the CapEx is highly dependent on rig availability, fuel prices, steel prices, and of course the market is quite volatile. A detailed feasibility study is still required to further evaluate energy capacity and costs, as well as the uncertainty and risk. Testing is also required to reduce the uncertainty and validate results of any detailed feasibility studies. Costs will of course increase if additional testing is then undertaken on the well, such as for research purposes. So that kind of summarizes the front end of the report quite quickly, because Corinna is going to jump in now with regards to the policy, research, legislation and regulation. Corinna, if you just say when, and I'll move the slides across for you.
Yeah, okay, thanks Mel. Yeah, so I'll just continue with giving you an overview of the policy research and regulatory research that we did, and a few highlights that came out of that. The objectives, as Mel said earlier, sort of were to review the geothermal policy, legislation and regulation in nations across Europe, as well as nations across the UK, assess the potential applicability to Northern Ireland, as well as sort of develop some conclusions and recommendations on what policies and legislations or regulatory changes could work for Northern Ireland to develop the geothermal sector. Next, please. So we done different things to achieve this. So first we done a review of the literature and sort of our knowledge across partners that we have in Europe to identify the main policies and regulatory mechanisms that are used for geothermal regulations. Then we looked at specific countries and we chosen them to be ideally sort of similar to in terms of geological settings and geothermal potential to the UK. Perhaps in this list, the exemption is Switzerland, which has more potential, but we included this because it had quite interesting policy mechanisms and learnings that we thought to include here. We also assessed sort of the applicability within the Northern Ireland context, and then developed some recommendations. Next. So looking at the policy mechanisms, so I kind of developed this little chart here summarizing the support measures that we will review and that I think we've seen as being widely used within the context of geothermal. And I split them in sort of direct support and indirect support. And you can read this for yourself. I won't sort of read through, but essentially the direct support is investment-based measures and grants, loans, risk guarantees, or production-based measures such as feed-in tariffs or feed-in subsidies of some kind, or also contract for difference. Indirect support includes taxation, funding for research, as well as sort of legislative tools like tax incentives or building regulations. Next. Now, we've also looked at what we've also compared these mechanisms to see what the advantages and disadvantages are of using them and where we have examples where it worked or didn't work. Maybe to just pick out here let's go for the insurance guarantee schemes. So there is a range of mechanisms that we've seen in use across Europe. And you have a reference there if you want to read up on this. These are seen as very instrumental because they address one of the largest challenges of geothermal, which is the risk, the high financial and geological risks associated with those schemes, especially when it's sort of in areas where there haven't been any previous drilling, or where the geology at depth is still quite unknown. The disadvantage is that some funds might be spent on projects that haven't been well researched, or you know, that are unsuccessful overall, unless a feed-in tariff where, for example, you only reward successful projects. The other one, perhaps, that was less obvious to me and that I've learned in this review, was that you need a sort of critical mass of projects before you can actually offer insurance schemes, because otherwise the setup won't work. And so it also needs to be accessible by the target audience. So the example here from Denmark is that they had insurance schemes in place, but no one actually used them because the procedure for application reporting were considered way too complex. And so these just weren't taken up because of it. Next. Here, yeah, I already mentioned sort of feed-in tariffs. They, you know, have the advantage that they reward successful projects. They can also be used the way you set them up to reward carbon savings. And we've seen an example of that in the Netherlands. And you can sort of separate out the different technologies, geothermal for electricity generation, as well as sort of shallow heat from deep heat. I think there is a bit of thinking that needs to be put into these mechanisms and how they are implemented. There might need more frequent reviews than perhaps an insurance scheme, just to make sure that the incentives are still attractive within the current market context. The Netherlands run a very, very successful feed-in premium scheme, but I think other countries, and I mean, Ireland is one, and Northern Ireland probably is one, haven't been so lucky, and sort of these schemes didn't go that well. Contracts for difference, interestingly, we haven't seen used in other countries, but it is a mechanism that's used in the UK. Although to date, there isn't any success no scheme has been successful in actually securing the funding from that mechanism. So I leave that for you to read in your own time. It's all in the report. Next. We have also looked, trying to understand what policy mechanism works. We've undertaken a review of individual countries and tried to develop a timeline. And again, I think it's for you to look at in the report, but to highlight perhaps that there is always a delay between when a mechanism comes into place and when it actually shows in the number of projects. And also there's a number of other, it's a number of other factors that influence whether a mechanism is successful, it's like a policy mechanism is successful, and that is sort of, global political events. And I mean, we'll all be aware of the knock-on from the war in Ukraine on energy prices and how that has helped renewables. So with all of that in mind, it is quite difficult to actually assess which specific mechanism has contributed to the rise in schemes. But I picked the Netherlands here simply to illustrate that there's been financial support for geothermal, and that's for deep geothermal developments here, mostly. That there has been financial support for deep geothermal projects for a long time. So starting in sort of 2005, when subsidies became available, and all the way through with a minor gap in, maybe that's just, in after 2010, but all the way through to today. And they've just in 2023, they're updating that feed-in subsidy again. So, and it'll continue going forward. The other interesting thing in the Netherlands is that, is here that they for a long time had like a free data tool which shows data availability across the Netherlands, and it's been developed into also helping with resource assessment and sort of estimating the risks of development of a specific scheme at a specific site based on the available information. that is seen as being sort of greatly influential and you know, supporting the sector and encouraging people to consider geothermal, but it's also helped the regulator and the sort of the implementation of that insurance scheme that the government runs, and sort of knowing that, you know, what the risk is that they're kind of ensuring within a particular project. Next, please. Yeah, so now this is another one, and this is Switzerland, which has also quite an interesting and quite complex history in supporting geothermal and going back quite a long way up to sort of pre-1970s. But the two things here that I wanted to highlight is one is the gap in policy. So policy is yellow. Apologies, I should have said earlier. So the policy support is the yellow bar, and you'll see a gap from 1999 to 2008, so nearly 10 years. And that's actually, if you look up into the top row where all the projects are listed, that gap is actually seen within the project developments, in that there hasn't been any projects developed between 1999 and 2009. And talking to colleagues in Switzerland, they you know, acknowledge that is, you know, they recognize that as one of the factors of why projects didn't go ahead at that time, the lack of government support. Also interesting in Switzerland is that they have quite an elaborate education system around geothermal with you know, university departments that teach a geothermal masters. And again, I think that's the purple, the research and education is the purple, are the purple bars. And again, that almost continuously goes away, you know, it started in 1975, going all the way through to today. Next. So once we've kind of looked at all the countries, and in the report, you'll get like a summary in the appendix. There's a summary for each country specifically with a bit more detail on the country and what, you know, we felt was special or kind of interesting within the context of the country. But then we kind of put it all into a table to see how these policies and regulations compare across. And here sort of the left is the table, on the right are the highlights. So interestingly, geothermal energy is recognized as a natural resource in most of these countries. In some, we weren't sure if we just haven't found the right source, or in others like Switzerland, it's very varied because the geothermal energy is regulated at the cantonal level. So, and some recognize it as a resource in other states. The permitting and licensing exists in all of the countries, the reviewed countries, both for deep geothermal and for shallow geothermal systems. Most countries have a national or local register for specifically for shallow systems like ground source heat pumps, so they know where these systems are and how much heat or cold they're abstracting from the ground. 4 countries have data sharing obligations for geological data. That's a mechanism I haven't mentioned before, but essentially it's either done on the national regulations. So in Germany, there is a geological data law where anyone who generates such data needs to share them after a certain period of time. And that needs to be, you know, with the government, but the government can make them publicly available. And in other countries, data sharing comes with the incentives. So when you get, you know, a subsidy from government for your geothermal scheme, then there is an obligation that you also share the data. And that's seen very widely as a very beneficial mechanism that all benefit from, even though they're, you know, initially it might seem that some lose out and others win. But I think in all the countries that we've looked at and people we've spoken to in these countries, there was consensus that opening up data and making them widely available, including sort of data from companies, is beneficial to develop the sector simply because it reduces the risk and the uncertainty around those schemes. And then a link to that is then obviously making those data available, or, you know, interpreting the data and producing a tool which kind of provides information and maps of the geothermal resource. And the reason for why that's seen as so beneficial is similar to what I just said. It's just the reduction in risk, the raising awareness, and all the benefits that come with that. Next. So another one of those, so in the policy research, we sort of compared policies. The one I've just done was regulations. So grant and loans for geothermal energy are available in all the countries, except for Denmark. There is government-supported risk insurance in all countries. Feed-in tariffs and premiums are available in 4 of the reviewed countries. And I should perhaps say that going a step back to the risk insurance, that in Germany, it's not an insurance scheme, but it is as part of the feed-in subsidy, you can, there is kind of an add-on mechanism that also covers some of the risk. So you can actually get more funding if you pay extra to get sort of your risk covered of the drilling, but it's not, technically it's not an insurance scheme. So interestingly also is that some countries use taxation to encourage uptake of geothermal. And again, that takes various forms. So it's higher, reduction of the taxation on electricity if you use ground source heat pumps, or a carbon tax for generating carbon. And all of these are seen as supporting geothermal, but it's really difficult to assess to what degree. So we haven't really got to the bottom of that, partly because those mechanisms haven't been in place for long enough. And similar sort of building regulations. So countries like the Netherlands, you're no longer allowed to install fossil fuel heating in new buildings. And that has been announced for the UK, but it's not for 2025, but it's not set in law yet. So it's still a bit uncertain what will happen with that. And then all countries invest in innovation and knowledge exchange projects. And the one that has come up and has been mentioned by many of our collaborators is Geothermica, that Ireland has signed up for, but I think the UK sadly hasn't. Next. So here's a bit on the energy landscape in Northern Ireland, and we reviewed that very lightly just to provide the backdrop, for what currently is in place in Northern Ireland before we make sort of our recommendations of what perhaps should be considered going forward. So Northern Ireland is committed to net zero by 2050 through the Northern Ireland Climate Change Act. Within the energy strategy, geothermal energy is recognized as an important technology that could contribute to decarbonization of heating and cooling in Northern Ireland. And it defines sort of actions, specific, so the associating action plan defines sort of specific actions for geothermal as kind of highlighted here. There's also been some recognition of geothermal in the Northern Irish Assembly, and there's been a debate probably 10 years ago, or nearly 10 years ago now. And local authorities, have an obligation to decarbonize, and that some include sort of geothermal in their local plans as part of fuel poverty reduction and affordable homes agendas. Next. In terms of regulations in Northern Ireland, and the same applies to the rest of the UK, geothermal energy is not recognized as a natural resource. There is regulations in place for ground source heat pumps, but only open loop because they are abstract and discharge groundwater, and that's regulated through the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development in Northern Ireland. Closed loop systems generally are not regulated, although some require authorizations. And currently there is no licensing for deep geothermal in place in Northern Ireland. Next. there is a few sort of policy activities going on, you know, I think they largely driven by the Department for the Economy. And so there is a Geothermal Advisory Committee. The department has commissioned a variety of reports. One of this we're presenting here, but there are others on looking at how the geothermal sector should be developed and across the country. And they are available on the website, and the link will be shown at the end of this presentation. There's also been the announcement of funding for demonstrators. Tendering has completed, so this is slightly out of date, but we'll provide an update at the end. And at present, there are no geothermal incentives following the collapse of the renewable heat incentives a few years back. Next. Okay, so now looking at so bringing all of this together, what we looked at sort of what's been done in other countries, what's happening in the Northern Ireland, what is the geology, and so one of the questions obviously is what are the opportunities? As Melanie already sort of said earlier, there is opportunities for both shallow and deep geothermal. Within the context of Northern Ireland, one of the very obvious applications for both shallow and deep would be to decarbonize the public estate, sort of include, and here's a list of the hospitals all across Northern Ireland. Another obvious application is using the heat for agriculture and horticulture. And one example where that's been used very successfully is obviously the Netherlands. But also there's potential for deep geothermal. Oh yeah, apologies. So DGE refers to deep geothermal, that's direct use, and SGE is the shallow geothermal energy, so ground source heat pumps and the like. Yeah, industrial manufacturing can benefit from, you know, and it requires slightly higher temperatures and can benefit from deep geothermal, possibly in conjunction with boosting it by a heat pump. But then obviously the residential sector, which at the moment has a large heating demand, but going forward might also have a cooling demand, will also benefit from geothermal developments in Northern Ireland. Next. So we then kind of come up with some conclusions and recommendations. I mean, one of the first ones we thought that is important is some recognition of geothermal as a natural resource in order to clarify ownership and enable sort of licensing. So that's a legislation. And again, that would be a recommendation possibly for the whole of the UK, because we feel that's sort of the foundation to develop the resource further, recognizing it to start off with. We also recommend the development of a regulatory framework once a natural resource is defined to enable the licensing and permitting of the resources. And given the differences in technology and the differences in how these systems are operated, there should be a differentiation between shallow and deep geothermal in those regulations. We also felt that, you know, the licensing and permitting framework for the shallow system should reflect the potential environmental impact. So in some instances, you might just need a registration so you know where these systems are. Perhaps there's some monitoring requirements, while in others, perhaps a license or a permit is more appropriate. For deep geothermal, we felt the licensing system would be recommended, also because it allows sort of definition of sort of certain conditions for the use, but also, you know, for decommissioning at the end of the lifetime, which quite often is forgotten, but is an important cost that needs to be considered. Next. So in terms of policy support, our recommendations are that for shallow geothermal energy, quite simple grant schemes should be considered, and they should be scaled according to the system size and not sort of one sort of value or one amount fits all, because obviously, you know, a residential system is much less expensive than, for example, you know, decarbonize a ground source heat pump system for an office block, and that should be reflected in the policy. For deep geothermal, we've kind of highlighting 3 options here. And that's really sort of the learning that we've seen, or what we've seen to work in other countries. Our Swiss model, as we call it here, is the sort of a grant scheme combined with an insurance scheme. From our assessment, that would sort of fit the market maturity, because it covers the risks, but it also covers the mismatch, you know, that helps to overcome the gap between initial investment and return on investment, which grant schemes sort of can address. You also, you know, another consideration could be the Dutch model, you know, a feed-in tariff combined with an insurance scheme. Within the Northern Ireland context, we recognize that there is, you know, political sensitivities around the renewable heat incentives, and so that's to be considered by the department as to whether they see that as a hurdle or not. The third model here is the German model, where it's a loan scheme with risk sharing options. So you get a upfront loan that you have to repay at the end of the projects, but you get it at good conditions, and you can extend it to include sort of risk sharing. For example, if you have to drill a deeper well or something like that. Next. Okay, so now here are all the different other recommendations, and we've listed here that support for demonstration projects is very important. I haven't touched on this in my presentation, but we cover that in the report, and we highlight the value of those to demonstrate the technology as well as the business case, as well as you know, engage with the public around them. So we see them as really high value. Legislative measures could be considered, as well as the availability of sort of a geographical information system, or some sort of data system that, or some sort of system that makes data available to potential developers, end users, councils, to highlight where opportunities exist and what the risks is associated with those. As part of this, data sharing obligations could be considered, and I've mentioned that earlier for the reasons for that. We'd also seen in some countries that government supports data acquisitions to improve characterization of the resources in areas where they have sort of white spots on the map, and that could, for example, be a model for specifically in areas where geothermal development is needed or wanted, or considered most beneficial, as well as sort of support for research and development, including sort of participation in international projects. Next. So we recognize the limitations of our sort of report here, and it's just saying that as a next step, we would recommend that the department engages with sort of all relevant stakeholders to prioritize the policy options. We've listed a lot here, but are not given a prioritization. And there's actually also, you know, consideration, or what we've not done here is a cost-benefit analysis of the different, you know, of the different support mechanisms and how they would support the different sectors. And I think I'm giving back to Mel on this.
Yeah, just to finish up. So obviously we completed this research back in December. So sort of a bit of an update for what has happened since. So our research was published in the end on the Department for Economy website in February. A geothermal demonstrator project has been tendered and was awarded February-March time. So this is the next step in the Northern Ireland Energy Strategy Action Plan. And this project's an overarching communications and marketing with 2 feasibility studies. So the feasibility studies are going to be used to understand the subsurface and identify sites to drill and install a shallow geothermal system and a deep geothermal system. The feasibility study for the shallow geothermal project should be based in the Stormont estate, and the deep geothermal feasibility study will be based in Greenmount Agricultural College in County Antrim. Geothermal is continuing to be discussed at conferences and webinars, even throughout the past 4 months. The Energy Strategy Action Plan for 2023 was published in March, so this follows on from the action plan for 2022, so it's been updated and continues to note about geothermal, and it discusses the fact that there will be a delivery of a geothermal demonstrator project. Some other projects of note that are kind of below the line that are relevant to Northern Ireland: the Department for Environment, Climate and Communications in the Republic of Ireland recently tendered technical services for the GSI for a national geothermal database product delivery project. And the Northeast Local Enterprise Partnership UK Deep Geothermal Energy White Paper is currently going through its final edits with a government launch date to follow soon. Corinna can give more of an update in the question answers as needed. So that's everything us. If you scan the QR report, it links you directly to our report. But I guess I hand over to Joe and Rob again.